He wasn't begging for food, and he wasn't lost. He was running out of time. The small German Shepherd puppy stood in the middle of the gravel road, ribs faintly visible beneath damp fur, his tiny body trembling not from cold alone, but from something deeper, something urgent, as the headlights of a slow-moving patrol vehicle cut through the early morning fog at the edge of Camp Ridley, North Carolina, where the pine trees stood tall and silent, like witnesses to things they would never tell. And behind the wheel sat Officer Emily Carter, a U.S. Marine whose steady hands had learned long ago how to hold a weapon, a radio, and sometimes, when no one was looking, the quiet weight of memories she never spoke about, her pale skin catching the faint blue glow of the dashboard as her hazel eyes narrowed at the unexpected figure ahead, and for a moment she thought it was just another stray, another animal wandering too close to restricted ground. But something about the way the puppy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink as the vehicle rolled to a stop a few feet away made her hesitate, the engine idling low, the world holding its breath, and when she opened the door, the cold air slipped in like a whisper, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and pine resin, and the puppy took one small step forward, then another, not toward her hand, not toward the vehicle, but toward her eyes, as if searching, as if choosing, and Emily exhaled slowly, stepping out onto the gravel, her boots crunching softly beneath her weight. "Hey there," she murmured, her voice low, careful, the way you speak to something fragile, something that might disappear if you move too fast. But the puppy didn't run, didn't cower, didn't bark. He simply stood there, his ears twitching slightly, his amber eyes locked onto hers with a focus that felt almost human. And then, without warning, he turned and trotted a few steps away before stopping, looking back over his shoulder, waiting, and Emily frowned, her instincts sharpening in a way she hadn't felt since her last deployment, because this wasn't random, this wasn't hunger, this was direction, and she had seen that look before, not in animals, but in soldiers, in the field, when time mattered and words failed. "No," she said quietly, almost to herself, shaking her head as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small protein bar, tearing it open and tossing a piece gently onto the ground. "You want food. You stay," she added, her tone firm but not unkind. But the puppy didn't even glance at it, not once, as if it didn't exist, as if nothing in the world mattered except the path behind him. And again he stepped forward, then stopped, looking back, waiting, and something inside Emily tightened, something old, something she had buried beneath years of discipline and silence. And for a moment she considered getting back into the vehicle, calling it in, letting someone else handle it, because that was easier, safer, cleaner. But the puppy didn't leave, didn't lose patience, didn't try to get closer. He simply stood there, a small, quiet presence against the vast stretch of morning fog, asking without asking, and the wind shifted slightly, brushing past them both, carrying with it a faint sound, so soft it could have been mistaken for imagination, a distant whimper, barely there, threading through the trees like a fragile signal, and Emily froze, her breath catching just enough for her to notice, just enough to feel the weight of it settle in her chest. And when she looked back at the puppy, he was already watching her, as if he knew she had heard it too, as if this moment, this decision, had always been his to offer and hers to take. And the world seemed to narrow down to that single exchange, one human, one small dog, and a choice that hadn't yet been made. Emily did not move right away, but something in her posture changed, a subtle shift that even she could not have explained, as if a part of her long trained to ignore anything outside protocol had suddenly stepped aside and let instinct take control, and the puppy seemed to feel it, his small tail giving the faintest twitch before he turned again and began walking with more certainty this time, not rushing, not darting, but moving with a quiet purpose that made it impossible to dismiss. And Emily let out a slow breath, glancing once back at her vehicle, the radio inside still crackling softly with distant voices, routine updates, normal life continuing without pause. Then she looked forward again into the line of trees where the fog thickened, and without another word she stepped after him, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp gravel before meeting the softer ground of pine needles and earth, the air growing cooler with each step, heavier, filled with the scent of sap, and something faintly metallic she could not quite place, and the sounds of the bass faded behind her, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her own breathing and the soft padding of the puppy's paws ahead. And every few feet he would pause, turn his head just enough to check if she was still there, those amber eyes catching what little light filtered through the trees. And each time she met that look, something tightened deeper in her chest, something that felt uncomfortably familiar, because she had seen that same silent urgency before, years ago, in a different place, under a different sky, when her own canine partner had once guided her through a situation where words had failed and trust had been the only thing left. And she pushed the memory down quickly, her jaw tightening as she focused on the present, on the uneven ground beneath her boots, on the branches that brushed lightly against her sleeves as the forest closed in. And then she heard it again, clearer now. A faint sound carried through the stillness, not wind, not leaves. Something softer, strained, like a breath that did not have enough strength behind it. And Emily stopped instinctively, her head tilting slightly as she listened, her training sharpening every sense. And the puppy froze as well, his ears lifting, his body going still except for the slight rise and fall of his chest. And then he looked back at her again, more intensely this time, and moved forward once more, faster now, weaving between trees with a familiarity that suggested he had made this path before. And Emily followed, her pace quickening despite the uneven terrain, her heartbeat picking up not from exertion, but from a growing certainty that this was not chance, not coincidence. And the ground began to slope gently downward, the air growing damp, the scent of earth deepening. And when she stepped over a fallen branch and pushed aside a low-hanging limb, the space opened slightly into a small clearing where the fog lingered thicker, curling low along the ground like something alive. And the puppy reached the center and stopped abruptly, turning in a tight circle before letting out a soft, almost inaudible whine, the first real sound he had made since she saw him. And Emily's breath caught as she stepped closer, her eyes scanning the ground, adjusting to the muted light. And that was when she saw it, not all at once, but in pieces, a shape that did not belong, a stillness that felt wrong, the outline of something larger lying partially hidden among the underbrush. And she froze for a fraction of a second, her mind trying to catch up with what her eyes were beginning to understand. And the puppy moved to her side now, pressing lightly against her leg, not for comfort, but as if anchoring himself, as if this was the moment he had been leading her toward all along. And Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely more than a whisper as she took one careful step forward. Easy. I am here. Though she was not sure who she was saying it for, the unseen presence ahead, the trembling puppy beside her, or the part of herself that had just crossed a line she could not step back from. Emily took another step forward, slow and deliberate, the damp earth sinking slightly beneath her boots as the shape ahead came into clearer view. And what she saw made her breath falter in a way she had not felt in years, not from fear, but from recognition. Because lying there, half-curled and barely moving, was a full-grown German shepherd, her coat matted with dirt and moisture, her sides rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths that spoke of exhaustion more than injury. And for a moment, everything else fell away, the fog, the trees, the quiet morning, until it was just the sound of that fragile breathing and the small, restless shifting of the puppy beside her, who now let out a soft whine and moved forward quickly, pressing his small body against the larger dog's side, as if to reassure her, as if to say he had done what he needed to do. And Emily felt something tighten sharply in her chest, something she had spent years holding together with discipline and distance, because this was not just an animal in need. This was a bond, a connection, a silent story written in the way the puppy leaned in, and the mother responded with the faintest movement of her head, her eyes opening just enough to find him. And Emily knelt down slowly, one knee pressing into the damp ground, her hands hovering for a second before she reached out carefully, her training guiding every motion, her voice low and steady. It is okay. You are safe now. Though she knew safety was a promise that had to be earned, not given, and the mother dog did not growl or pull away. She simply watched, her eyes tired but alert, as if measuring the human before her. And Emily noticed then the subtle details. The way the fur along the dog's flank was pressed awkwardly, the way her posture was held too still, not from calm but from restraint, and her gaze dropped slightly, scanning the ground more closely until she saw it. Partially hidden beneath leaves and debris, a length of thin metal wire, tight and unmoving, not immediately obvious but unmistakably out of place. And Emily's jaw tightened as understanding settled in, not as anger but as urgency, because this was not something that would resolve on its own. And she reached into her belt pouch, her fingers finding the small multi-tool she always carried, flipping it open with practiced ease, her movements careful, deliberate, making sure not to startle the animal as she leaned closer, and the puppy shifted slightly, watching her every move, his earlier uncertainty replaced now with a quiet stillness, as if he understood that this moment mattered. And Emily worked slowly, her hands steady despite the faint tremor she could feel in her chest, the kind that came when something personal surfaced without warning, because in the back of her mind, uninvited but persistent, was the memory of another dog, another moment where time had felt just as thin, just as fragile, and she pushed that memory aside, focusing instead on the task in front of her, easing the tension of the wire just enough to allow the mother to shift slightly, her breath catching for a second before settling again. And when the final bit of pressure gave way, Emily exhaled quietly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. "That is it. You are okay," she murmured, her voice softer now, almost instinctive, and the mother dog responded with the smallest movement, her head lowering just enough to rest against the ground beside the puppy, who immediately pressed closer, his tail giving a faint, tentative wag. And for a moment, just a brief, fragile moment, the world felt still again. But Emily knew it would not last, because this was only the beginning. And as she reached for her radio, her eyes caught something else just beyond the immediate scene, a slight movement near the edge of the clearing, so faint it could have been missed entirely, and she turned her head slowly, her breath catching once more as the realization began to form that the story this puppy had led her into was not yet fully told. Emily's hand paused midair, the radio still untouched at her side as her eyes fixed on that subtle movement near the edge of the clearing, something small, barely more than a shift in the fog, and she slowly turned her head, her breath quiet, controlled, the way it had been trained to be when stepping into the unknown. And there, half hidden beneath a cluster of low brush and fallen pine needles, she saw them, two more tiny shapes, curled close together, their bodies so still they almost blended into the earth itself. And for a second her mind resisted what her eyes were telling her, because they were so small, so fragile, and yet unmistakably alive, their faint movements barely visible except for the slight rise and fall that mirrored the shallow breathing of the mother. And Emily felt her chest tighten again, deeper this time, not with urgency, but with something heavier, something that settled into her like a quiet truth. And the puppy at her side seemed to sense it too, breaking away from his mother just long enough to trot over to the small bundle, nudging one of them gently with his nose, a soft whimper escaping him as if calling them back, as if urging them to hold on. And Emily moved instinctively, shifting closer on her knees, her gloves brushing against the damp ground as she leaned in, her voice lowering even further. "Hey, I see you," she whispered, though she knew they could not understand the words, only the tone, only the presence. And carefully, slowly, she extended her hand, not to grab, not to startle, but to hover just above them, feeling the faint warmth that told her what she needed to know, that they were still here, still fighting in the quiet way that animals do, without sound, without complaint. And behind her, the mother dog let out a soft exhale, almost like a release, her body relaxing just enough to show that she understood, that the threat had passed, that the one her puppy had chosen had not turned away. And Emily swallowed hard, the moment pressing against something inside her she had tried to forget, because this was not just a rescue anymore. This was a responsibility, one that reached beyond protocol, beyond orders, into something far more personal. And she finally reached for her radio, bringing it up to her mouth, her voice steady but softer than usual as she spoke into it, requesting assistance, giving coordinates, her words precise, yet carrying an undertone that only those who knew her would recognize. And as the faint acknowledgement came back through the static, she lowered it again, her focus returning immediately to the small lives in front of her. And the puppy returned to her side once more, pressing gently against her leg, his earlier urgency now replaced with something quieter, something almost like relief. And Emily let out a slow breath, her hand finally lowering to rest lightly against his back, feeling the warmth of him, the steady beat of a life that had refused to give up. And for a moment she closed her eyes, just briefly, as the sound of distant wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of memory, a handler's voice, a dog's steady presence, a moment she had never fully let herself grieve. And when she opened them again, her gaze was clearer, more grounded, as if something inside her had shifted, not broken, but realigned. And she looked between the mother, the puppies, and the small guide who had led her here, and in that quiet clearing, with the fog still hanging low and the world still holding its breath, Emily Carter understood something she had not allowed herself to believe in a long time. That sometimes help does not come in the form you expect. Sometimes it arrives on 4 small paws, without words, without hesitation, carrying nothing but trust, and asking for one simple thing in return, that you follow. The forest did not feel as cold anymore, but it felt heavier, as if every second carried more weight than the last. And Emily remained kneeling there, grounded in the quiet center of something fragile and unfolding, her hand still resting lightly against the puppy's back, while her eyes moved carefully between each small life in front of her, measuring, assessing, holding onto the calm that years of training had carved into her. And yet beneath that calm, something softer was beginning to surface, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, because this was no longer just a situation to manage. It was a moment to protect, and she shifted slightly, adjusting her position so that she could reach the 2 smaller puppies more easily, her movements slow and deliberate, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke again, not to command, not to instruct, but simply to be present. "You are okay. Just stay with me." And the words were as much for herself as they were for them. And the puppy beside her leaned closer, pressing into her leg as if anchoring himself to her now, his earlier urgency replaced with a quiet vigilance, watching everything she did, trusting without hesitation. And Emily exhaled slowly, her breath steadying as she gently brushed away some of the damp leaves near the smaller pups, careful not to disturb them too much, just enough to give them a bit more space, a bit more air. And she could feel it then, the faint warmth beneath her fingertips, the subtle signs that they were still holding on, still present in this fragile space between struggle and survival. And behind her, the mother dog shifted slightly, not in distress but in awareness, her eyes following every movement Emily made, not with fear, not with resistance, but with something quieter, something that looked almost like acceptance, as if she understood that this human was no longer a stranger, but part of the moment her own puppy had created. And Emily met that gaze briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, one that needed no words, no explanation, only presence. And then she turned her attention back to the radio clipped to her vest, lifting it again, her voice more grounded now, more certain, as she updated the situation, requesting immediate transport and medical support, giving clear directions, her tone carrying that unmistakable edge that came when something mattered beyond routine. And as she listened for the response, the faint crackle of confirmation reaching her through the static, she felt a shift in the air around her, not something physical, but something internal, a quiet realignment of purpose. And she lowered the radio once more, her focus returning entirely to the small family in front of her. And without thinking, she removed her outer jacket, the fabric still warm from her body, and carefully folded it before placing it gently near the puppies, creating a small barrier against the damp ground. A simple act, but one that carried a weight she could not fully explain, because it was not procedure, it was instinct. And the puppy immediately stepped closer, settling partially against the jacket, his body finally relaxing just enough to show that the tension he had carried was beginning to ease. And Emily watched him for a moment, really watched him, the small rise and fall of his chest, the way his ears flicked at every sound, the way his eyes, though still alert, no longer carried the same urgency. And she realized then that he had done his part. He had found her, led her, trusted her, and now he was waiting, not for instructions, not for reward, but simply for her to finish what he had started. And Emily swallowed hard, her gaze softening as she reached out again, her hand resting more firmly against his back this time, grounding both of them in the same quiet moment. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of an approaching vehicle, tires moving over gravel, voices carried lightly through the trees, and Emily closed her eyes for just a second, letting that sound settle into her. Because help was coming now, but the moment that mattered most had already happened, the choice to follow, the choice to stay, the choice to care. And as she opened her eyes again, she remained exactly where she was, steady, present, and unwilling to leave until every life in front of her had a chance to continue. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, tires pressing against gravel somewhere beyond the tree line, voices calling out faintly through the fog. But Emily did not stand, did not step away, because the space she occupied now felt like a boundary that could not be left unattended, and she kept her focus steady on the small lives gathered around her, her hand moving gently between the puppies, adjusting the fold of her jacket to keep them shielded from the damp ground, her movements careful, measured, as if even the slightest disruption could tip the fragile balance they were holding onto. And the puppy who had led her here remained pressed against her leg, his breathing slower now, more even, yet his eyes still alert, still watching her with that same quiet expectation, and Emily could not ignore it anymore, that unspoken understanding that had passed between them, because he had not just found help, he had chosen her specifically, and that realization settled deeper than she expected, reaching into a part of her she had kept guarded since the day she lost the last partner who had ever trusted her like that, and she swallowed hard, her jaw tightening slightly as she forced herself to stay present, because this moment was not about memory, it was about now. And behind her the mother dog shifted again, this time with a little more strength, her head lifting slightly as she looked toward the sound of the approaching team, her ears twitching, her body still weak, but no longer completely still, and Emily noticed it immediately, the subtle change, the faint return of energy that told her something inside that animal had begun to stabilize, and she nodded almost instinctively, as if acknowledging the effort. "That is it, stay with me," she murmured again, her voice low and steady, and for a brief second the mother's eyes met hers, not fearful, not uncertain, but aware, and it was enough, more than enough. And then the voices grew clearer, boots stepping through brush, branches shifting as the rescue team moved closer, and one of them called out her name, sharp at first, then softer when they saw her kneeling in the clearing, and Emily turned her head slightly but did not rise, lifting one hand just enough to signal them forward, her expression calm but firm, silently telling them to slow down, to match the pace of the moment rather than rush into it. And they understood, adjusting immediately, their movements quieter, more deliberate as they approached, taking in the scene piece by piece, the mother, the puppies, the wire partially hidden beneath leaves, the jacket laid out as a barrier, and the small puppy still anchored at Emily's side. And for a second no one spoke, because there are moments even trained professionals recognize as something more than routine, something that demands respect before action. And then the medic knelt beside her, opening a small kit, his hands moving with practiced precision. But even he kept his voice low, matching the tone Emily had set, asking brief questions, receiving quiet answers, the exchange efficient yet gentle. And Emily shifted just enough to give him space, while still keeping one hand close to the puppies, maintaining that connection, that presence that had carried them this far. And the puppy leaned into her again, more fully now, his small body finally relaxing as if he understood that the burden he had carried alone was now shared. And Emily felt it, that shift, that release, and she exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she had been holding since the moment she stepped off the road and into the trees. And as the team began preparing to move the animals carefully, wrapping them, lifting them with care, Emily stayed right where she was for one more second, her hand resting gently against the puppy's back, her gaze soft but steady. And in that quiet pause, surrounded by fog and the soft sounds of movement, she realized something that no training manual had ever taught her, that sometimes the most important mission is not the one you are assigned, but the one that finds you, led by something small, silent, and determined enough to believe you will follow. The clearing slowly came back to life with quiet, coordinated movement, as the team worked carefully around Emily. Their voices low, their hands steady, and she finally shifted her weight, rising just slightly from where she had been kneeling for what felt like much longer than it had been, her legs stiff but her focus still locked on the small family being lifted one by one, wrapped in soft blankets, shielded from the cold that still lingered beneath the trees. And the mother dog did not resist, did not pull away. She simply watched, her eyes following the puppy who had never left Emily's side. And when the medic gently guided her onto a stretcher, there was a moment, just a brief pause, where her gaze searched for him, and the puppy responded immediately, stepping forward, placing his small paws against the edge as if to reassure her, as if to say he was still there. And Emily felt that moment settle into her, quiet but powerful, the kind of connection that did not need explanation. And she stepped closer without thinking, her hand hovering near the puppy's back again, grounding him as the team began to move, and the sound of boots on soft earth replaced the stillness, branches shifting as they carefully made their way back toward the path. And Emily walked with them, not leading, not following, but staying exactly where she was needed, her presence steady, her eyes moving between each movement, each breath, each small sign that told her the situation was holding together. And the puppy stayed close, never more than a step away, his earlier urgency now transformed into quiet vigilance, his head turning slightly with every sound, every shift, but always returning to her, always checking. And Emily noticed it, that repeated motion, that silent habit, and something inside her softened in a way she had not expected, because trust like that was not given easily. It was earned in moments like this, in choices made without hesitation. And as they reached the edge of the trees, where the morning light finally began to break through the fog, casting long, pale beams across the ground, Emily felt the weight of the moment begin to change, not lighter, but clearer, as if the uncertainty had given way to something more defined, something that could be carried forward instead of simply endured. And the vehicles came into view, engines idling, doors open, equipment ready, and the team moved with quiet efficiency, transferring the animals carefully, securing them, making space for the ride back. And Emily stood there for a second, just watching, her hands empty now, her role shifting as the immediate urgency passed. But she did not step away, not yet, because the puppy remained at her side, looking up at her with those same steady eyes. And for a moment, everything else faded again, the noise, the movement, the routine, until it was just that look, that silent question that had not yet been answered. And Emily crouched down slightly, bringing herself closer to his level, her hand finally resting fully against the side of his neck, her fingers pressing gently into his fur, feeling the warmth, the life, the quiet strength that had carried him this far. And she exhaled slowly, her voice soft, almost unsteady despite herself. You did good. You found me. And the puppy leaned into her touch without hesitation, his small body finally relaxing completely, as if the mission he had taken on was now finished. And for the first time since she had seen him on that road, Emily allowed herself to feel it fully, the weight, the relief, the quiet swell of something she had not let surface in a long time. And she closed her eyes for just a second, not to escape the moment, but to hold on to it, because she knew that moments like this did not come often, and when they did, they left something behind, something that stayed long after the sound of engines faded and the forest returned to silence. And when she opened her eyes again, she was still there, still grounded, but no longer the same as she had been when she first stepped off that road and into the unknown. The ride back felt longer than it should have. Even though the distance from the clearing to the base was barely a few miles, the vehicle moving steadily along the narrow road as the morning light slowly pushed away the last traces of fog. And Emily sat in the back beside the crate where the puppy had been placed, her posture straight, but her attention entirely focused on the small shape inside. Because even now, even with the team handling everything with practiced care, she could not bring herself to look away. And the puppy seemed to sense it, lifting his head slightly each time the vehicle shifted, his eyes searching until they found hers again. And every time they did, there was that same quiet recognition, that same unspoken connection that had formed somewhere between the road and the forest. And Emily rested her hand lightly against the edge of the crate, not reaching in, not interfering, but close enough to be there, to let him know he was not alone and across from her. One of the medics adjusted the blanket covering the other puppies, his movements careful, his expression focused but softer than usual, and the low hum of the engine filled the space between them, steady, grounding. As the base came into view ahead, the familiar outlines of buildings and fences rising out of the morning light, and for a moment Emily felt something shift inside her again, not tension this time, but something quieter, something that felt like a door opening just enough to let something back in. And she did not try to close it, not this time. And when the vehicle finally came to a stop, the team moved quickly but calmly, unloading the crates, carrying them toward the veterinary unit where bright lights and clean surfaces waited, and Emily stepped out after them, her boots hitting the pavement with a soft, solid sound that reminded her where she was, what her role had always been. But it did not feel the same anymore, not exactly, and she followed closely as they brought the animals inside. The scent of antiseptic replacing the damp earth of the forest, the sounds of equipment and quiet voices taking over from the wind and leaves, and as the mother dog was carefully transferred onto a treatment table, her eyes opened again briefly, searching, and the puppy responded immediately, letting out a small sound as he shifted in his crate, and Emily noticed it, stepping closer without hesitation, her presence steady as ever, and when the medic gently opened the crate to check him, the puppy did not try to run, did not pull away, he simply stayed where he was, looking up at Emily as if waiting for confirmation, and she gave it without words, just a slight nod, a calm expression, the kind that said everything he needed to hear, and he settled again, his small body relaxing just enough to show that he trusted what was happening, and Emily exhaled quietly, her shoulders lowering as she stepped back just a fraction, allowing the team to continue their work, but not leaving, not yet, because something in her knew that this was not the end of the moment, only a transition, and she stood there, watching as each small life was cared for, as the mother's breathing steadied under careful hands, as the puppies were warmed and checked, and she realized then that what had started as a simple patrol had become something far more significant, not because of the outcome alone, but because of the path that had led her here, a path chosen not by orders, not by duty, but by a small, determined life that had refused to give up. And as she looked down once more at the puppy, who now rested quietly, his eyes half closed but still aware of her presence, Emily Carter understood something she had not fully allowed herself to believe in a long time, that sometimes the most meaningful connections are not planned. They are found in the moments when you decide to follow, even when you do not yet know where the path will lead. Time moved quietly inside the veterinary unit, measured not by clocks but by breathing, by small movements, by the subtle return of life where only fragility had existed before, and Emily remained there longer than she needed to, longer than her shift required, standing just outside the treatment area as the team worked with steady focus, their voices low, their hands precise, and every now and then one of them would glance in her direction, not questioning why she stayed, but understanding that some moments do not end when the task is complete. They linger, they settle, they ask to be witnessed fully, and Emily did exactly that, her arms resting loosely at her sides, her posture no longer rigid but grounded, as her eyes moved between the mother dog, now resting more peacefully, and the puppies, who had been carefully placed together beneath a warming light, their small bodies no longer curled in uncertainty but beginning to stretch into something safer, something more certain. And then her gaze returned, as it always did, to the one who had started it all, the small puppy who now lay on a folded blanket inside a low crate, his breathing steady, his eyes half closed but still aware, still following her whenever she shifted even slightly. And Emily felt it again, that quiet pull, not urgent anymore, not desperate, but steady, like something that had found its place and was no longer searching, and she stepped closer, just a few inches, enough for him to see her clearly, and his ears twitched softly before he lifted his head, meeting her gaze with that same unwavering trust that had led her into the forest hours earlier. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them filled with something that did not need explanation, and Emily slowly crouched down, her movements unhurried, her hand reaching out until her fingers rested gently against the edge of the crate, and the puppy shifted forward just enough to close the distance, pressing lightly against her hand. And that was when it happened. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, the way the most important things often do. Her breath caught, just for a second, and her vision blurred slightly as something she had held back for so long finally gave way, and she closed her eyes, not to hide it, but to let it pass through, because this was not weakness. It was release, and when she opened them again, there was no tension left in her expression, only a softness that had not been there before, and she let out a slow, steady breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew I would come." And the puppy did not move, did not need to, because his presence alone was answer enough, and Emily stayed there for a moment longer, her hand still resting where he could feel it, her gaze steady, grounded, as if committing this moment to memory, not as something extraordinary, but as something true, something real. And when she finally stood, stepping back just slightly, it was not with distance, but with understanding, because the path that had begun on that quiet road had not ended here. It had simply changed direction, and as she turned to leave, her steps calm, her posture steady, she paused once more, glancing back just long enough to see the small puppy settle down again, his body relaxed, his eyes finally closing fully. And in that quiet, unspoken exchange, everything that needed to be said had already been understood, because some stories do not end with a final word, they end with a feeling, a stillness, a quiet kind of grace that stays long after the moment has passed. And as Emily Carter stepped back into the rhythm of her world, she carried that with her, not as a memory of what had happened, but as a reminder of what still could, that even in the smallest act of following, something greater can be found, something that does not ask for recognition, only for the courage to see it through.